Hello, I'm Jared Weiss.
And I'm Alex Benson.
We are Ethereal Sunrise. We are here today to talk about the final song from our debut album, Steady as Rock. That song is A Soft Rain. Um, Now, Alex, I think you and I are proud of each and every song on this album, but I think it is fair to say um, that this is probably, in both of our eyes, our crowning achievement. But this is the third and final one that we co-wrote.
hmm
Um, but it started with an idea from you, Alex. So why don't you tell us about that a little bit?
Yeah. And so one of the rules that we'd had throughout this album was we wanted it to be generally a high energy album, and to sort of really be able to just sort of plow through with a consistent level of energy. And then it sort of arrives to this last song, and it's the only real ballad on the album. Um, and it's, the most acoustically based of all of them by far. Um, and of course, it's the one that's 13 and a half minutes long. So if you're going to make a song that long, you better cover some dynamics. The basic framework that I think we were looking for with the song was let's make a sort of a classic progressive rock epic. Um, in that same vein as the early King Crimson records and Yes and Genesis and all of those sorts of um, just the classic of the classics of progressive rock. And so I think the first thing that I had actually written for the album was the very end of the song. And the chord progression that goes under that ending guitar solo. And that was sort of the basic framework. And we were sort of initially thinking, let's have a bookend that will actually open with what the song ultimately closes on, and then it will sort of reprise that at the end and do sort of like a starless thing by King Crimson. Um, and then sort of as we sort of went along with like, well, what other sorts of sections do we want to have? I know Jared, you sort of came up with this almost flamenco-esque intro that ultimately became the intro to the song. And we sort of realized it was redundant to have kind of two intros before it actually gets into the body of the song. They're like, well, one of these is this nice acoustic, unique thing that we haven't really done before and really immediately sets it apart from everything else on the album. And the other didn't really need to be there since it was going to have its time to shine a little bit later. And so I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about how you sort of came up with that intro.
I have long admired, and I think you have too, Alex. John McLaughlin, the jazz guitarist. He also has a lot of more acoustically influenced works, including things drawing on flamenco. Um, and I wanted very much to do something like that. As it turns out, it's really hard to be John McLaughlin, but it does retain a little bit of a flamenco flavor. We each played a guitar during that. I think it's like a 40-second intro.
Mhm.
There's the I'm the initial guitar that comes in. I think exclusively on one channel, the left channel maybe. Um, and then you come in with kind of the lead part superimposed once I start doing more of the arpeggiated chord part beneath. And I think your tone on that acoustic guitar is a very flamenco esque tone there,
Mhm.
and lends that feel very nicely. Um, in the end, I do think it framed the song nicely, particularly because later in the song, the initial acoustic, your lead line gets loosely recreated in a very different context.
Mhm.
That wasn't by design. It was only when I realized that the lead part would kind of work over the chord pattern later in the song that it's like, maybe we should do that. And I think we ended up recreating kind of that bookend effect that we had initially envisioned through that.
Mhm.
And then we'll come to the end solo a little later in the discussion. Um, but the end solo then becomes almost like it's like a worm at the end of Starship Trooper by Yes. It ends up just becoming this really fantastic uh dramatic conclusion to this extended piece that's come before.
The verses were pretty much all me.
Yeah.
And it had been that I wanted to filter those early King Crimson albums through, the followers of those albums. And so there had been in particular, a Steve Hackett song called Love Song to a Vampire that also kind of recreates this classic In the Court of the Crimson King sound, but uses this really cool tremolo classical guitar technique throughout to create a lot of the atmosphere. And I was like, well, that's a really cool trick. So I'm going to steal that trick. It lends itself to this incredibly kind of dark and mournful tone that the song kind of immediately started taking shape on. The verses would be, very quiet and austere and intimate in terms of the vocal performance, and then it would sort of blow up into this massive chorus. And so when it came time to let's find a chorus, I knew I wanted some kind of lead guitar line to be on top of that. And I don't remember if it was me who suggested it or you who just decided to use the slide guitar to
I,
sort of
I
anchor that.
right. I think it was my idea, but it was because you had played for
March of the Hierophants, I think it's called.
oh yes, that sounds
Something about
very
the
familiar.
Hierophants.
Yeah, yeah.
That there was a tone in that I was like, I really love that tone, and can we do something like that for the
Right,
chorus?
right. When you have a kind of an echoey effect on a single string slide guitar part, you get just this unbelievably mournful tone. Um, that I really liked in the Steve Hackett song, and I thought would really fit well here. Um, so the line came first. Um, then I came up with the chords that just fit the line. Other than that, Alex, you really developed all of the vocal harmony
Mhm.
lines that went. I mean, this was true for the verses as well. Really, for the actual vocal melodies and the arrangement of all of these different vocal parts, you really were responsible for that.
Mhm.
I don't know if you want to talk a little bit more about how you developed that part.
I think we both wanted to make sure it kind of actually contrasts the music and the lyrics a little bit, and that the lyrics would be, as intimate as they get on this album. And so I wanted the verse melodies to really have that sort of intimate feel. And so there's not, a lot of vocal gymnastics on it, and it's in a more kind of speech register compared to a lot of the rest of the album, which has sort of been more that sort of shouty rock and roll territory. And the verses were also then kind of structured so that there was a lot of space to be able to tell a story with it. And again, to sort of contrast the chorus with the verses, if the verse lyrics are as intimate as can be, then it blows up into the chorus, which just becomes more kind of ethereal in the fact that there are no lyrics on the choruses. And it's purely just the vocal lines. And so those lines were sort of developed to, at times be kind of parallel to the guitar and at times be contrasting, and to really just explore different types of motion in terms of moving melodic lines on that segment so that it could have as much kind of melodic resonance as possible.
It's worth giving a shout out to our good friend Ari Feinberg at this juncture,
Mhm.
the only guest musician to appear anywhere on the album, who has a nice deeper vocal register and supplies the lower part that comes in midway through the third verse, continuing into the chorus. Core of the Crimson King in particular stands out as an influence on kind of the lyricless choruses, just sort of ahs or ohs or what have you. That's straight out of that playbook, I think,
Mhm.
and worked very well here. It's funny because the lyrics were the last thing that got written for this. We had the entire song arranged, I believe, and no lyrics. I think we knew we might want to tell a story with it, but we had no idea what story we were going to tell. I had this story. Basically a true story. I only modified some details, and without going into too many specifics, I had encountered someone who was dealing with the loss of their younger sibling. They, as a family, they had come to the United States. They were born in another country, across the world. They came to the United States when the older brother, who was late teen, maybe around 18, 19, who's sort of at that stage of life where you have ideas of what you want your future to look like. You have a sense of maybe what you want to be, where you want to go. What is your independence going to look like as you start to branch away from the family unit? Um, and then very suddenly and unexpectedly, this got ripped away when the younger brother became sick. And for whatever reason, it was felt that there was the kid required healthcare in the United States. So very suddenly they uprooted their family life and came to the United States, and all these this future that he had envisioned for himself. The older brother had envisioned for himself at that stage of his life was gone. Because suddenly you're in a new country, you have almost no money, all the social connections, all of your friends, it's all behind you. Um, the job opportunities, for a new immigrant to the United States compared to what you may have been able to do in your home country. Um, and so he ended up becoming resentful of the younger brother, who's obviously wasn't his fault that he became sick. The younger brother was a model citizen, really stand up guy in the community. And the older brother became estranged from him, estranged from the family, despite uh, them all having been very close as children. And it was only after the younger brother unfortunately passed away suddenly, many years later, um, that the older brother was able to reflect on these dynamics, understand the damage caused by his own resentment that came from a very real and understandable place. It was probably the most powerful human story possibly I've ever heard, in real life. And I knew I wanted to commemorate it in some way, put it down in a song or somewhere. Um, and as this song developed, I was like, you know what, I think I think this will fit here. I think this will work. And I am very struck by how well it ended up fitting the song, the arrangement of which was already complete. Um, Despite not having been designed in that way. And maybe that leads us into a discussion of some of the instrumental sections we haven't talked about. Um, because, the first one that comes after the second verse is this kind of flute, uh, bolero type pattern that Alex, maybe you can talk about a little bit. But it comes right after the second verse explains that they're about to make this move to America. The flute section strikes me as fitting. It's like a journey. They're going on this journey. They're going on this trip, and I think the instrumental section evokes that. So I don't know, Alex, if you want to talk about that section a little bit.
Sure. So the chord progression under that flute solo and the flute solo itself were both things that I had written, and so I immediately knew going into that section I wanted it to switch from minor to major, so that there was just a brightening of tone after this really long stretch of sort of doom and gloom in a sense, uh, and also just to kind of evoke that, I talked to the wind off of in the Court of the Crimson King
Yeah.
kind of tone, and then that sort of sinks into the more epitaph off of the Court of the Crimson King type of tone over that bolero pattern. Um, and yeah, it's probably my favorite flute solo on the album, in large part because it's so surrounded by this kind of increasing kind of lush atmosphere and the more acoustic sounds, and it's just very evocative of the Moody Blues as well, and sort of all of
Yes.
those really old school but timeless at the same time type of music that just it feels like it could it's just so ethereal that it could kind of come out of anywhere, and then of course it then rises to this big sort of mellotron climax that goes into the third verse that then sort of resets the dynamic again so that it can go from the quietest ultimately to the biggest chorus and then into the next segment of the song.
Right. And it works particularly well because that initial, the first however many bars it is that's in D major, it almost conjures the excitement of, oh, we're going to America, we're going to a new place. This is, I mean, this is going to be a whirlwind. This is going to be, the initial excitement that comes with such a change, and then as it transitions back into the minor territory and builds more and more, you feel the sorrow of leaving behind, you know, the place you've known for your entire life, and if that transition is emotionally overwhelming, and it feels more overwhelming the more that builds underneath this just beautiful flute part. Um, so again, just a case where I think we got lucky in how well it ended up fitting what the lyrics were going to be about. And then we get into a tale of two climaxes. You were going to end the song, Alex, with a guitar solo over that initial chord pattern you had envisioned. That was sort of the starting point for the song. And then you were like, I want to solo for 6 minutes like David Gilmour. And I was like, I'm sorry, what? It is tough to write and come up with a compelling, especially on a studio record. I find, in a live setting, obviously songs get stretched out, solos get stretched out, but when you have the crowd energy to feed off of as you're building something, it's easier to get away with that. And while I've always admired Alex's abilities on the guitar, especially lead guitar, I was definitely skeptical. And you said, let me try. And I said, all right, come up with a solo. We'll see what happens.
Yeah.
So do you want to talk about how you actually did that?
Sure. So first of all, that chord progression that's under it, I had sort of developed it from a kernel that I had learned from Mike Oldfield, actually, from his Tubular Bells, and that it's been observed that the intro to Tubular Bells, the reason why it's so effective and why it can be there for 5 minutes and you're not bored of that same pattern is because of that single dropped beat. And so I end up making it an alternating pattern, and it's almost subliminal, but it does train your ear that it doesn't get as tiring. And so with this chord progression, there's just that one half measure that's just in there that then completely, shifts the sense of rhythm while also being kind of subliminal and not necessarily noticeable unless you're specifically paying attention to it.
Right.
And so I think knowing that I had that basis of it's just going to be the same chord pattern repeating again and again and again for almost 5 minutes, that it had to have that thing in there that made it that it wouldn't get tiring on the ear to just be sort of hearing that on repeat. And so when I was making the solo, what I had done is I just recorded a loop of that chord progression and I just looped it out for about 20 minutes. And I would just jam over that section again and again and again and again and again. It became rapidly clear that what it needed was a little bit of structure, to sort of help it along its way. And again, I was looking at folks like David Gilmour. When I listen to a bunch of different versions of Comfortably Numb, I can hear that there are consistent parts that show up at certain times that he goes back to sort of anchor his solo in between these improvised parts. And so that became, rapidly abundantly clear that needed to happen for this as well. And so, and you can hear that in the solo that anytime that it's sort of that repeating riff that it sort of goes through it twice, it's like, okay, that's the anchor that's sort of prepping us to say, okay, now we're going to go on to the next section. And so, some of it was constructed trying to just use techniques you learn from Gilmour and some of the other classic guitarists in terms of some of the dirty blues licks. And then it got to that sort of arpeggiated part, which wound up sounding kind of like Hotel California, but was actually supposed to be more of a Deep Purple thing, and some of the neoclassical riffs. And so, I started with that 20 minutes and I would use that time to sort of start developing some licks that I liked and some anchors. And once I started to develop some anchors, it was like, okay, how much space do I really have between these anchors that sounds like a natural buildup? And so it gradually became a little bit more structured while still maintaining some structured places for it to be unstructured. That is to make sure that there was still some improvisation always going on so that it always sounded fresh and always sounded spontaneous.
Right.
And so, and I knew it was going to climax the way climaxed with that end melody, because that again had been the initial seed of the song. And so it was just, you know, from listening to it a lot and playing it a lot and gradually weaning back the length of the solo until I was like, okay, this is the length that I feel like really kind of tells the story that we wanted to tell through this instrumental means. And it also sounds consistently engaging. And sort of the last piece of that was the only things that I had going on was that background loop, uh, and then the lead guitar solo, because I wanted that guitar solo to be engaging with literally nothing else under it.
Right.
Because if that wasn't enough to do it, then the guitar solo hadn't turned its place. And so I remember when I initially presented it to you, I was like, okay, phew, I got it down. That that was the final product of what that guitar solo was. And so everything that was built around it came after.
And there are plenty of extended solo sections out there where it derives its strength and length from the interplay of instruments. And I knew that this really shouldn't be that because of how powerful this guitar voice was on its own. And everything else is just working to support that. Um, so I knew that I wanted a fairly I didn't want a terribly complex arrangement around it. It's bass. The organ comes in pretty early. You get one or two um just low ambient synths to provide atmosphere that kind of enter the picture as the solo progresses, and that's pretty much it up until the final, glorious ending. um the organ just would follow the chords most of the time, and really it was about the bass, because I did need to support the build of the song without overpowering, or of the solo, without distracting from the solo. And if the organ was going to follow the chords, if the drums were going to not be too showy, it had to be coming from the bass. So I think the approach ended up being pretty similar. I knew what the anchors were that I would be working with because the solo was there. Um, the bass starts mostly just following the chords, and then it becomes increasingly. I don't know if melodic's the right word. There are certainly sections where it is melodic, and in one or two instances, it actually responds very directly to your guitar. There's a moment where you do a very fast descending lick of like nine or 10 notes or whatever, um, and then you leave a little space, and so and then the bass kind of comes in and mimics it during that space. Um, but most of the rest of the time, there was no space. Most of the rest of the time, the guitar is doing things. So I whether it was going higher in terms of the register on the bass or being a little more complex in how much I was playing, but still within the chord form so that it didn't interfere with the melody of what you were doing on the guitar. Um, and I would record, one time through the pattern at a time and sequence those segments until it ended up being something uh cohesive, supportive of the guitar without overpowering or distracting from the guitar. And I think as soon as the bass was there, because the bass is what I did first, before all the keyboards and things like that. As soon as the bass was there, I was pretty sure that this was going to work. Uh, the final stretch, that last minute over the composed part, I mean, the Mellotron had to be there. There was never any question about that. Um, but really, I think it was very calculated to wait for that bombastic release until it's been earned. We have to earn it through these 3 minutes of soloing before we can have that release. And because the emotion is building so powerfully in that section, you want to wait until it's really ready to burst, and that's the moment it bursts. So you have this rush of mellotrons. At some point, I think we kind of joked about having some tubular bells at the end, and then at some point I think I realized I actually want tubular bells at the end, So as much as possible, we recreated that sound using the software. Um, and if I recall correctly, because you really left the arrangement of that section around your solo to me, I think it was my decision to have it end with just that single guitar note um, ringing out.
Yeah, I
Uh,
think as I recall it, because when I had handed it to you, there was also nothing there.
right,
And we're like, well, are we leaving that? We're like, I don't know. And then as it developed, it was just sort of like yeah, actually, it makes a lot of sense to sort of keep it that way and just have everything cut out suddenly and just leave that guitar, that last
right,
note.
right. As a it really is the final catharsis of the song. But I wanted that reminder at the end that look, in the end, this is the story of an individual. This is the sorrow of an individual. This is the emotional mm, release for an individual. And in that final section, it's embodied by your guitar solo and your guitar tone. And I really didn't want that to be lost in the bombast at the very end. The arrangement of the end section, I think, was mostly, I think a lot of it was there, or at least the solo was there
Mhm.
before I came back to the preceding section, which just had all that was there was again just a little bit of the chord pattern underneath, some basic placeholder drums, and the slide guitar part, the na 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 na, that without any of the surrounding instrumentation. Um, so again, I was, I had Alex's guitar solo, and I was like, I can't go for, kind of the show-stopping powerhouse type solo here. Again, I'm not as good at it, and we've got 4 minutes of it coming up. Um, so I have to do something different here. Really, the thing that set off the tone of what that section was going to be was when I was fiddling with an effect called the ghost piano, which was something you had used and sold my soul, Alex, in the
Mhm.
choruses, just to support the chords. You had this da 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 da, but with this kind of eerie, echoey effect that there was meant to provide atmosphere. But I really liked, as I would mix individual parts. I liked that effect a lot, and I was just fiddling with it, and I kind of just started walking up note, half step by half step on this piano, and I just loved the effect, and I was like, wow, this is really dissonant. I'm just going up chromatically, and boy, do I love chromatics. I ended up developing, this very dissonant, chromatically influenced section that's really eerie. It's almost off-putting. Um, and it fed nicely off of that slide part, because the slide part does kind of rely on those half step transitions. You end up getting something that just sounds radically different from what follows. And tying it back into the lyrics, this represents almost the emotional turmoil. This section that's so dissonant, eerie, almost off-putting, preceding your final solo, which becomes the emotional catharsis. This is the anguish. What comes next is the release. This is where the acoustic guitar bookend from the intro comes in, um, kind of as the culmination of the slide solo. Um, the bass really drives this section. It works very firmly within the chord progression, but gets increasingly busy as you go along. Was really, I think we'd always, I think I'd always wanted to try and be a little John Wetton on Starless on this one. But when I realized that the end solo wasn't going to be where that was going to happen, because the guitar had to be the dominant voice, I really wanted the bass to drive this section instead, which I think worked very well to anchor all this dissonant chromatic stuff going around it. It also is worth noting that as the slide switches, the slide part transitions to my solo, a mellotron takes over with that repeated pattern, making this a song where we had 3 different variants of Mellotron across the entirety. If you have 3 types of Mellotron and tubular bells at the end, you've hopefully done something that would make some of the prog greats smile at least a little.
I'll just also give a call out to that nice day in the life slide up that goes into the final section that I particularly enjoy.
Yeah, yeah,
It helps give some forewarning that, oh, something's coming, something, and then boom, it hits you with that last section, and it fits so well with the transition.
there was a part of me that worried that the acoustic guitar, even though from a musical standpoint it felt right for it to go to bookend it, might, just from a tonal standpoint, be a little anticlimactic before you go into this final section. So I got the idea to do the slide walk up. And what I ended up, this wasn't how it was originally designed, but as we were mixing and transition, putting more things into stereo, and I was like, I don't know where to fit the slide here without it either getting buried in the mix or stepping on the toes of something else. And I wanted to have that build without overshadowing all the other instruments going on at that time. So what I ended up doing is I did it in stereo. I started them as far apart, and then I have them pan towards the center, converging from both sides. By the time it reaches the end, it's in the center. And so I think a lot of the power, the effect ended up coming from not just the part, but from the way it ended up being mixed. I mean, it's the best song I've ever been a part of, as far as I am concerned. It's the lyrics that I'm the most proud of. It's the best story I think I've ever told, from a lyrical standpoint. And I'm very happy and consider myself very lucky that through this collaboration with you, Alex, that it got the justice that it deserved. If I was going to dare to try and recreate it in a musical way.
Hmm. Yeah, it's definitely the song that, despite it being as sad and dark as it is the song that puts a smile on my face every time.
Right.
It's like, yes, we did it. We
Yeah.
actually did it.